Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the COVID-19 vaccine, Facts Not Fear, Vaccine Safety Webinar for Healthcare Providers for December 15th, 2020. My name is Donald Moore, and I'm with the Virginia Department of Health. I'll briefly cover a few admin announcements before we get started. The discussion format is 45 minutes of moderator questions of the expert panelists and 15 minutes of Q&A from attendees using chat functionality. Attendees who joined by telephone who have questions should send their questions to epnrtraining@vdh.virginia.gov. Your feedback is requested regarding the panel discussion webinars. If you look in the chat box now, there is a survey link. We kindly ask you to complete that. Unanswered questions will be collected and answers provided in a FAQ document and made available on the VDH COVID-19 Vaccination Response webpage. Our experts panel is Dr. Lillian Peak, Director of Epidemiology, Virginia Department of Health, Dr. Kosti Sifri, Professor of Medicine and Director of Hospital Epidemiology, UVA Health, Division of Infectious Diseases and International Health, and co-chair of Virginia VAW Safety and Efficacy Subgroup, and Dr. Tyson Bell, Assistant Professor of Medicine, UVA Health, Division of Infectious Diseases and International Health, and Director of Medical Intensive Care Unit. Your moderator is Dr. Michael Martin, who is the president of the Virginia chapter of AAP. Now I'll turn this over to Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Donald. Really appreciate the introduction. And I want to extend my gratitude again to the Department of Health, and this time for making and coordinating this event tonight and giving us time to speak about something very important again, this time COVID vaccine. I also want to give thanks to the COVID Vaccine Advisory Work Group, in particular Wendy Klein, who's been the co-chair of the communication subgroup and has also helped me in making this possible tonight and has agreed to help with some of the questions that may come up at the end as well. Lastly, I want to thank the panelists for making your time available, even some of which have gotten the vaccine today and are still here. So I think that's a testament to how well it's working. But I want to say it's an absolute honor to be on this virtual stage with you all with your credentials for tonight to talk about something that's so important. And certainly the COVID vaccine couldn't come sooner as we head into the holiday season and positive COVID cases are exceeding 15 million. Hospitalizations are over 100,000 and we have upwards of over 300,000 deaths, unfortunately. It's an historical moment to see so many vaccines for COVID produced in what really is a short period of time. But I want to start there tonight because I think that is, and certainly in my interactions with physicians, both pediatricians and adult docs, some of the hesitations about the vaccine have come from that rapidity with which these vaccines have been produced and how fast they came into being. So Dr. Sifri, I'm going to actually start with you. If you could tell us a little bit about the process of pushing out the vaccine so quickly and really kind of identify what does it mean to have emergency use authorization?
Great. Thank you for having me, Dr. Martin. I'm really happy to be here. And that's a big question. I'll see if I can try to talk about it succinctly, but they are, I think, perhaps two of the biggest questions that we're dealing with. How was this vaccine and hopefully now soon to be vaccines developed so quickly and with some terms like Operation Warp Speed that imply perhaps some cutting of corners? Can we truly trust that they are safe? Then, after they are developed, why are we using this entity called emergency use authorization rather than a normal licensure process? So I'll take those in two parts. So the first thing I think I am getting some feedback. The first thing to realize is that, thank you, this COVID vaccine, the target for the COVID vaccine, the spike protein, was a well-recognized target that really dated back to the original understanding of SARS-CoV-1, SARS coronavirus originally in 2002, 2003. And, I think it's probably a good target probably for most coronaviruses. That's what we hear from the coronavirus experts. So the understanding that this is where immunity lay against coronaviruses was, understood now nearly 20 years ago, 17, 18 years ago. And it was, also confirmed looking at MERS. And what I think is sort of the groundbreaking issue is the development of new plug and play type of platforms for vaccine development. And so those are not only the messenger RNA, the mRNA systems that we know about with Pfizer and Moderna that's now also being reviewed, but also the adenovirus vector-based vaccines like AstraZeneca's and Johnson & Johnson that are in trials, and even Novavax's with recombinant protein. So we have new technologies that we're ready to go with a good target. And so once the genome of this virus is identified, I believe on or around January 7th, 66 days later, the clinical trials for the messenger RNA vaccine were underway based on clinical trials at the NIH. Getting a little bit of feedback again too. So that's the first thing that at least I tell my patients and my team members that are in the hospital saying, boy, this is really rapid. It is rapid, but I think we need to understand that it was built on science that was a decade or a decade and a half coming into being. Messenger RNA vaccines, we can talk a little bit about later. We're happy to have that conversation. But the second thing then is to understand the vaccine development process through Operation Warp Speed. Again, a name that I'm not a particular fan of. The first thing was that the phase 3 clinical trials were conducted through existing clinical trial networks, and actually a group of 4 of them that were knit together involved in other vaccine research. And under a single umbrella organization with a harmonized IRB, a harmonized data safety monitoring board with the same clinical outcomes, the same efficacy measures, the same side effect profiles, the same immunologic response evaluations that will be coming out later. So all harmonized. So we're taking a look at these vaccines at the same time. And actually, in the future, you're going to be able to compare apples to apples. They're going through a very similar process of development. And at that same time, the other thing that was accelerated was development of the vaccine. So investments were made for manufacturing by the companies that were involved in this private-public partnership to retool factories to make the vaccine, and those were occurring concurrently with the phase 3 clinical trials. And then the final part of this is an understanding that the emergency use authorization, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the rest of the evaluation of these clinical outcomes occurred the same way that other medications would be evaluated by our governmental agencies that review these products, the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC. So they have independent advisory committees that reviewed the data that were submitted to those organizations. They, as we now well know, seeing this come out last week as we watched it go through the FDA and through their advisory committee, VRBAC, and then through the weekend through the evaluation through ACIP, ACIP, that the normal processes occurred in those evaluations, leading to the granting of the authorization. So I think that's the key thing, is that we had both manufacturing occurring at the same time that the authorization was being reviewed, so that and the clinical trials actually were being performed, and importantly, the understanding that there was a decade or more of research that went into the identification of these targets. And the final thing I should have mentioned that I don't think I emphasized enough was that the technologies to produce these vaccines using messenger RNA, for example, were our recent developments. They allowed for this plug and play availability so that we could go from a target to a good vaccine candidate in a much more rapid fashion than we could have 5 years ago. So that's the development process. The emergency use authorization, there are sort of 2 different options, maybe 3, and when we're thinking about new therapeutics. Emergency use authorization is simply a time-limited authorization of a medication that essentially has to meet criteria for its use because its benefits outweigh the potential risks of not being able to, having seen the full evaluation of a therapy over a longer period of time. The granting of a license is a more rigorous process where typically we would anticipate to see a year, several years of follow-up following a vaccine like this. So I think that is, in essence, what it is that it's the big difference between this authorization and then licensure is the duration of follow-up.
Yeah. And actually, I'm going to go a little off the script, but I mean, I think that's an important point that I want to make sure people understand. So in a normal study trial period, how long would they be studying out before it would be granted FDA approval?
Yeah, usually it would be at least a year. Sometimes it's even several years. So that you would follow that, outcomes after a vaccine study like this, and then you would a pharmaceutical company that would then submit for approval. So it's worth noting from what I understand, and others on the on the call may correct me, but the evaluation, I think, for Pfizer's product will occur it's going to be around 9 months, probably in aggregate after its initial use. It's I think slated to occur in May or so of 2021, May, June. And so I think that at that time point, they'll have more summary data of its safety and efficacy, through that period of time, and more information regarding its use in some special populations.
Right. And Dr. Bell, I was hoping, since you're the first person on our panel, I think, to actually have gotten the vaccine, if you could talk a little bit about who are the good candidates, and are there people that weren't included in the study that in the Pfizer in particular, the one that's being used right now, and maybe the Moderna as well. Are there people that should not get, and who is okay to get based on who's been studied in these trials? Oh, we can't hear you.
I always mute because I've got young children in the background. This was approved under EUA for 16 and older. So children were not included in the phase 3 trials. One big frustration that ACOG and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine had is that pregnant and lactating women were also not included in the trial as well. No specific recommendations there, although they were allowed to be considered to take the vaccine. So no recommendation made against people in those specific populations. So, from my standpoint and public health standpoint, as many people as possible who are in that age range, and if there are some specific concerns, such as someone who's immunosuppressed or someone who may have contracted COVID in the past, someone who is pregnant or breastfeeding, then that's a conversation to have with your physician.
Okay. Nursing mothers, I don't know if you addressed that. That's a question that I'm getting. There's a number of people who may be nursing. Would that be something that you would recommend, or is recommended at this time to get the vaccine?
Sure. So by the ACOG statement, what they put out was that they have no concerns when it comes to making this vaccine available to pregnant and nursing mothers. We know that passive immunity is a proven mechanism for passive immunity from mother to baby. The fact that pregnant and lactating women were not included in the trials is frustrating for sure, but there are no specific safety concerns that have been identified based on either the technology or what we've seen so far. There are good examples of physicians, other healthcare workers who have posted examples of themselves signing up and taking the vaccine, who are either breastfeeding or pregnant or nursing. Again, I think a discussion to have with your physician, but nothing that's been specifically identified as a risk, just that they were not included in the trials.
Another population, I guess, is the question: if you've had COVID infection, is it recommended to get the vaccine, as well as, how far out of infection would it be safe to get the vaccine if the answer is yes?
Sure. And let me point out a comment by And Kellam's Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine also put out a statement in support of vaccination safely while nursing. So another strong statement of support from a professional society. So I appreciate that. And that's why I love forums like this. What was your specific question? I can get to it if I forgot it.
So the question is about if you've had infection before.
Oh, yes. Yeah, right.
And how soon after you could get the vaccine.
Right. So there were a small population of people that were in the Pfizer trial. I believe it was around 1,000 or so who were seropositive at enrollment, and I did not see the specific outcomes for that population other than the reinfection rate and infection rates were low in both cases. We know that immunity can wane and protection can wane from COVID-19 over time, and that window that we've identified is 90 days. So people are outside of that window that we could consider them potentially at risk of obtaining an infection again. What the guidelines suggest are that people who have had COVID-19 in the past, particularly if they're in that 90-day window, that there's no necessary urgency to receive the vaccine in that window, and people who may not have been exposed or in higher risk categories can be prioritized. And then later, when people fall out of that window, then they can go ahead and receive the vaccine itself. But there's no recommendation to not receive the vaccine if you've had COVID-19 before, because we know that immunity can wane to that.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to flip back to you, Dr. Seifried, as well. So everything right now in the news has been about the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. Anything else that's coming down the pathway that we can look forward to?
So there's at least 3 other vaccines that are in late phases of clinical trials. The AstraZeneca vaccine is a vector-based vaccine. That's so it's an adenovirus-based vaccine. Johnson & Johnson is another adenovirus based vaccine, and it's notable. We haven't heard about clinical results of that, but it's notable for being a single vaccine. It's being studied that way, so maybe offers some hope that we may have less complex vaccine schedules. And then the third vaccine to mention right now is the Novavax vaccine, which is a recombinant protein-based vaccine, again of the spike protein, the S protein. You may recall, but I'll remind you if you haven't, or I'll let you know if you haven't, the adenovirus vaccine that was made by AstraZeneca, we've heard about some interim analysis of that vaccine, demonstrating that it had about 70% protective immunity. And what was interesting and not quite yet explained, and also, this is also interim analysis, so should be, taken with a bit of a grain of salt, is that the difference in immunogenicity depended on what occurred with the dosing schedule. So if a person received a full dose between the first and the second doses of that vaccine, the protection was in the 60% range. If they received a half dose, the first immunization, and then the booster was the full dose, then they had 90% protection. There was a smaller population that sort of fell into that group. So we'll see. There may be some differences that are yet to be explained about how that vaccine performs. But that, and then I'm not as familiar with some of the data that's come from China regarding their vaccine. I think what's we're hearing from the preclinical trials and the phase 1 and phase 1/2 clinical trials is that the S protein, that spike protein I talked about earlier, is a pretty robust target. So hopefully that will translate into an ability that we'll have a suite of vaccines that will be available as we move forward into 2021. And we'll see. I think one of the open questions is there going to be a group that are winners, or the messenger RNA vaccine is going to be incrementally better than others. And I think that just remains to be seen.
Right. Thank you very much. So Dr. Peak, I'm going to move over to you because we have some logistics. We got some vaccines that might come down, but we have some vaccines now that have gotten delivered. There are certainly challenges related to storage and transporting these vaccines. Can you talk about the logistics that we're kind of facing right now? So we're seeing that some of the larger institutions locally are getting, but not our smaller practices and things. Can you talk a little bit about the logistics of the cold storage for the vaccines?
Sure. So the Pfizer vaccine does present some logistical challenges. It does have to be shipped and stored at ultra cold temperatures, and that's not something we've had to deal with in the past for vaccines. Pfizer did create some thermal shipping containers, and those can be used by using dry ice and re-icing them for up to 30 days. So they're trying to work through that. The Moderna vaccine can actually be shipped and stored frozen, and we are used to dealing with, we have other vaccines that we manage the same way. So that one's not as difficult.
And I guess one of the questions, I know you indicated Pfizer may be having some of these smaller packs. Do you foresee having those delivered outside the hospital? I mean, right now it's hospitals, pharmacies that are primarily delivering the vaccine. Do you foresee practices, smaller entities being able to get allocations of that?
So before we even had specifics about what was coming, when Pfizer put in their application for the EUA consideration, we started working with healthcare systems to identify those that had ultra cold freezers. And so we've identified that the initial Pfizer order went to 18 facilities that had that ultra cold freezer capacity, but they're serving as, many of them, most of them are serving as a hub and spoke model. So they are getting the vaccine out to smaller groups. It does come in large, yes, the minimum order for Pfizer is 975 doses versus Moderna, that's 100 doses. So our preference is to use the Pfizer vaccine for these health systems that have the ability to manage the ultra cold temperatures, and then also to use that hub and spoke model to get it out. We're also going to be using the Pfizer vaccine for the Federal Pharmacy Partnership, which will be doing the vaccination at long-term care facilities. That's just two facilities, two entities, CVS and Walgreens, and they've been working for quite some time now, putting the processes in place in every state to be able to manage that. So that's what our plans are now. We want to be able to use the Moderna vaccine for the smaller clinics and hospital clinics and local health departments that don't necessarily have access to the ultra cold freezers.
Right. So that's hope for us in smaller settings, I guess, which is good. One of the things I would ask, just as far as letting the audience know, so in order to receive vaccine, there is a process that BDH has set up if you're going to be a site for the vaccination. And how does that work?
Sure. So the vaccine is all purchased by the federal government. It's owned by the federal government, and it is going to be provided to vaccinators for free. But just so that you know, you can still charge an administration fee. You can't charge for the vaccine, and you can't pass any costs along to patients, but you can charge an administration fee. So but the ordering of the vaccine and the allocation at this stage is all being managed by states. So if you want to be a vaccinator, you need to enroll. On our website, there's a intend to enroll form, so you need to complete that, and then you do need to sign an agreement with CDC, and there are some requirements in that. And some of those requirements are reporting all of the doses to our immunization information system, VIS, and also to go into a system called Vaccine Finder and report your inventory each day. So that's the process for signing up. Currently, we're working through the health systems and the local health departments and those CVS and Walgreens for phase 1A.
Okay. Could you actually go over a little bit, because I have had questions about that even today, in terms of that breakup and where inpatient, outpatient, where those priorities fall and what we anticipate. So I know some of the hospital systems have kind of put tentative dates. Do you have a sense of that for us as well?
I don't have specific dates for areas, but let me just tell you the process. So we do have a very specific process in Virginia. After FDA approves the vaccine, CDC allocates how much the states will get, and that's based on the population. So for Virginia, it's like 2.6% of the supply, and it just depends on what's available, what they have from the manufacturers. And then CDC, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, they recommend the initial allocation. And they're doing that based on science, feasibility of implementation, and ethical principles. And so because they're going through that process, we're adopting the ACIP recommendations. So if they recommend a group and there's enough vaccine that we're allocated to cover that entire group, then we would just ship it directly. But if there isn't, then we would make recommendations to our the COVID-19 Vaccine Advisory Committee for comments, and that's a group that has some of you are members of. It has a lot of diverse members, and they would provide comments on our recommendations, and then it would go to the Virginia Disaster Medical Advisory Committee. And that's a group that was actually put into place to make decisions about scarce resources. So that's the input that would go to our state's unified command to make those recommendations. So we did that for phase 1A. We didn't know, when we went through that process, we only knew about the first about 70,000 doses. After that time, we found out that we should plan for, it doesn't mean we'll get it, but we should plan for receiving about 480,000 doses in December. And the estimates for the phase 1A, which are healthcare personnel and long-term care facility residents, are pretty close to that. So we probably have enough vaccine for that entire group in December. But when the VDMAC met, they did divide healthcare personnel into 4 levels, if you will. The first one is healthcare personnel who are directly engaged in caring for COVID patients or suspected COVID patients, or they have direct exposure to infectious materials. The second is healthcare personnel who are interacting with patients that we know are at higher risk for infection. And that's because, like in a dialysis center or in a nursing home or EMS. The third level is other employees in clinical care or critical categories in health systems that are really critical to keep the healthcare systems going. And then the fourth is all other healthcare personnel who interact with patients that aren't known to have COVID. So the outpatient providers fall into that fourth category. But the VDMAC, we have enough vaccine and this for the group, and the VDMAC has said while we want to follow that order as much as possible, there aren't hard cutoffs. We don't want vaccines sitting on the shelf. So it's not, 50% or 75% of one group has to be vaccinated before you go on to the next. Facilities will be working that out and sticking to that as much as they can, but being practical. Also, for the long-term care facilities, ACIP also, they actually recommended levels, and it's nursing homes, assisted living, then residential care communities, then intermediate care for individuals with developmental disabilities, and then state veteran homes. So in Virginia, because almost all of the long-term care facilities opted in to this federal long-term care facility partnership with Walgreens and CVS, we had to activate that partnership, if you will. And the earliest we could activate it with using the Pfizer vaccine is the week of December 28th. So that's when those vaccines will start to be given. And the pharmacies have said they should be able to give the first doses within 3 weeks.
Okay. I'm going to tie in a little bit. I think this has been a question. So you're not based in the hospital. So I know in the hospital systems, people are being alerted to process in terms of getting the vaccine. For people not, in the hospital system or affiliated, what should they be doing to make sure they get on a list, or their employees that are, and many of us are testing out in the field, COVID, and taking care of some of those patients? What should we be doing in order to make sure we're on those lists and get our employees vaccinated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, at PDH, we ask the healthcare systems to help us vaccinate non-health system healthcare personnel, and many of them have agreed to do that, but not all of them were able to. So each health district, the health director is working with their health systems that are in their district and understanding what they're able to do to help others outside of the health system, and then they're filling in the gaps. So it's going to be different in different parts of the state, whether you'll be able to go to the healthcare system as a non-health system employee, or you'll be going to the local health department. So the best thing to do is to reach out to the local health department, and just, you can say, hey, we're here. But they know we've provided them with estimates and guidelines, and they are now in the process of setting up clinics. Of course, they don't have vaccine yet because they're waiting for Moderna vaccine, but they're in the process of doing that planning, and they'll be doing that outreach. And so they'll be working through that in the next few weeks.
Thank you. And I know we're going to have more questions, but I do want to make sure, folks, that I move on. So I do want to talk about the vaccine and concern with side effects, which certainly have made the news. And so, Dr. Bell, you got the vaccine. You look good. You look fine. That's a good thing.
Still here.
Still here. But we do anticipate, and I know, having done some clinical trials myself and being involved with vaccines, I mean, we anticipate with all vaccines some side effects. And I will say this, there does seem to be a higher % of those mild, symptoms even in patients. Can you comment a little bit on, what expected side effects, especially in the first 72 hours, one is to anticipate?
Sure. Well, one thing to point out is that the side effects were more often experienced with the second dose of the booster vaccine than the first when they were reported. But the things that I can tell you that I'm experiencing now, I have a little bit of arm soreness from the vaccine going into my deltoid muscle itself, and I pretty much expected that. Outside of that, which is the most common side effect that was reported, headache, fatigue, and muscle pain. And I would imagine that for most of the people on the call, that would sound like a normal Tuesday. But it is clear that the vaccine can cause some reaction. There was a handful of people in the trials that had fever, some that reported chills. The important thing to point out is that serious adverse events were extremely low and around the same I'm talking about the Pfizer trial, in the placebo and the actual vaccine arm. So I think 0.5 or 0.6% in either case. So by and large, it's a very safe vaccine. We've had a good amount of follow-up from the trial itself over 8 weeks, and it's unusual for long-term side effects new side effects to show up after that sort of time period. So it does demonstrate that there's some safety and efficacy. In an effort to be fully transparent and open with the community and the public, I am going to be posting updates on any symptoms that I'm experiencing so that people can understand what to expect and the range of symptoms that people can experience. But by and large, a tolerable vaccine that can cause some expected changes.
Okay. And I know, Dr. Sifri, you've been studying some of this as part of your subgroup in terms of safety. I know Bell's palsy has been something that has been raised. There's allergic reactions to the Pfizer vaccine. Can you comment on some of the things that we've seen in the media, or small numbers that we've seen, and should we be concerned?
So just a couple of comments. So I think Tyson hit the nail on the head. I think we're going to have to work to try to find language that strikes the appropriate balance. That's not too scary, but is able to prepare people to understand that probably after the second vaccine, and particularly the second vaccine in people who are younger, that people are probably going to have a little more reactions than they would with a standard flu vaccine, for example. So if we undersell it, I think that we may cause some, may not be an honest assessment of what to expect. On the other hand, as we experience this through large populations, I think then we'll probably gain an understanding of what it'll be like, and people will become, sort of comfortable to know with knowing what to expect. I think one of the challenges that we're thinking about a lot is understanding how these symptoms differ from COVID itself, since COVID has such a very large syndrome complex that can be quite varied. Of course, being asymptomatic, but can be just the same things that Tyson just talked about. Muscle ache, fatigue, maybe a low-grade temperature. Those are all side effects of the vaccine, and also can be those presenting symptoms with COVID. Maybe without, you won't have a loss of taste and smell. So one of the things that we're anticipating from an occupational health standpoint is efforts to try to distinguish those two. As Tyson said, the clinical trials suggest that these occurred within the first 48 hours, the first 2 days or so of the vaccine. They usually lasted 1 to 2 days. So one of the things that we're going to be stressing with our we have been stressing with our employees, I think, as we think about this vaccine in our patients, is to give this information to them so that they can anticipate what to expect for the day or two after the vaccine. Now, if you take a look at more serious side effects, those have been very rare. They were not shown to be very significantly increased. For example, in the phase 3 clinical trial for the Pfizer product, and we'll see what the Moderna looks like. The things of note you actually mentioned there, Dr. Martin. So one was a numerical increase in the amount of Bell's palsy in the vaccinated patients or individuals compared to those who received placebo. I believe there are 4 that had it in the vaccinated group and 0 in the placebo. So that's an interesting finding. The report suggested that may not be outside the bounds of what you'd expect for a population, but I think that's something to watch as we move forward and see this vaccine used in populations. The second thing to touch on is the lymphadenopathy. That was more significant. It occurred in a higher percentage of patients who received the vaccine compared to those who received placebo. And again, not dissimilar to sort of the reactogenicity side effects. It could be a marker, I think is a marker of immunologic response to the vaccine. So again, not a thing to be concerned about, but at least something to perhaps call attention to as you're doing the vaccine. And then the third thing that is worth mentioning and made its way into the CDC guidance is concerns regarding anaphylaxis or other severe allergies, based on the post-marketing initial response that we've all heard about in the UK, where there were 2 nurses, from what I have heard, who had a history of having anaphylaxis that had a severe reaction. It sounded like requiring an EpiPen after getting the vaccine. So based on that information, the CDC has provided some guidance on how to approach that. And it's maybe a little bit similar to what Tyson had talked about before. So the first thing is, if you have an allergy specifically to the Pfizer product, that should be considered to be a contraindication for second vaccines. And importantly, in the clinical trial, there were not significant. There were not anaphylactic reactions that were more common in the vaccine group compared to the placebo group. So that was rare, but importantly, patients, individuals with a history of anaphylaxis were excluded in that clinical trial. So if somebody has a reaction to the first one that is of concern and along that spectrum, then they should not get the second dose. And we would anticipate with future vaccines that would be perhaps an option for them down the line. The persons that have reactions to injected medications, such as vaccines or other medications that are severe and have an anaphylactic spectrum, what the CDC recommended was to have those individuals should have a conversation with their provider, that there should be a discussion that weighs the risks and benefits of the potential reaction to this vaccine compared to the known benefit of this vaccine, the apparently known benefit of this vaccine. And so I think that's the type of conversation as providers that we could anticipate. There's not a contraindication or a precaution that I saw for things like food allergies or latex allergies, which are common questions. In our neck of the woods, we get people that ask about meat products and vaccines and things like that, in case they have alpha-gal or some other reaction, and no reports of that. So the components of the vaccine are listed on the CDC website, but they're simply for the Pfizer vaccine, the messenger RNA with a lipid carrier.
Okay, great, thank you. And Dr. Peak, this gets to you. So we're still learning. We're kind of mapping these potential side effects. Is there anything that the Department of Health is doing? Is there a mechanism in place for us to track side effects, report these things, so that if there is something that we're seeing it and that we're tracking it?
Yes, well, we'll be using the federal systems. We have very good systems in place to monitor the safety of vaccines. So there's the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, VAERS, and under the emergency use authorization, providers are required to report serious adverse events, but anybody can report into that system, individuals or providers. So it's a very open system, and it makes it very sensitive for picking up rare side effects. There's also two systems that work with networks of providers, and it's a review of medical records. So it's the Vaccine Safety Data Link and the Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Project. So those will be used just as they're used for all vaccines. But CDC has put a few things additional in place. So they created a new smartphone-based tool called vSafe, and it uses text messaging, and then it takes you to a survey. So it'll send a text to you, and it'll take you to a survey to do a check-in, a little health assessment, and that'll be done for, I think it's up to 2 weeks afterwards, and then it gets, it continues on, but at longer intervals. And so that is both so that's really more of a little more active surveillance, trying to reach out to patients and ask them to report any side effects. It also gives a reminder for the second dose. So we are recommending that providers give an information sheet about vSafe and recommend to their patients that they participate in that program. Also, ACIP stood up a COVID-19 vaccine safety technical subgroup, and they're going to be reviewing all of the vaccine safety data, and they'll be advising CDC on the post-licensure safety monitoring, and that'll be an independent review. So that's helpful. And then if something does happen, then CDC will work closely with FDA to rapidly assess any potential safety issues, and they have agreed to be very transparent and work through the ACIP to get that information out there. So we expect that information to be shared.
Great. And Dr. Bell, we're glad to see that you had a green face, so I think that means you're feeling well and using the app. So we appreciate that. And I'm actually, we're sort of running on time. I keep getting this, I'm sure you all, I'm still finding employees, healthcare people that are still, some of them, they're parents of my patients, expressing great hesitancy about getting the vaccine. Maybe as we kind of close here, I would love to hear both you, Dr. Bell, and Dr. Seafree, your thoughts on they're in front of you now. What would you tell these folks about the vaccine that should make them want to get it and feel safe doing it?
And sure. So I'll take the first stab at this. I think one thing to point out is that there's been encouraging movement in the general appetite for Americans to take the vaccine. So I remember over the summer, it was less than half or maybe around half of people said that they would take a vaccine if it were available to them at the moment. At this point, I saw a poll that showed 71% of overall respondents said that they probably or likely would receive the COVID-19 vaccine. I think if you talk with someone who studies organizational psychology, they would tell you that most people fall along a spectrum when it comes to adopting new things, whether it's technology or pharmaceuticals or therapeutics. There's a very small percentage of people who say, put me to the front of the line, sign me up, no questions asked, let's do this. That's rare. It's also very rare to have someone who will say, under no circumstance ever in history will I ever do something like this. And fortunately, that's rare for us as well, too, in this circumstance. I think most people fall on the spectrum around the range of I'm willing to do it, I might do it, but I want to see what happens first. So I think there are a lot of people who are waiting for this first wave of vaccinations to kind of make a decision from that point. But that's an opportunity for us to actually work hard on messaging to make sure that people's concerns are addressed. And they fall into a bunch of different lines, but the questions that I've received so far are along the information gap. So, for instance, I saw one poll in the African American community, 50% of respondents think that the available vaccine is actually going to give them COVID-19. So we have to be very clear with people that the vaccine does not give you COVID-19. Makes you generate a spike protein that's a part of the coronavirus, but not the coronavirus itself. And that, by definition, cannot cause infection there. I think it's also important to address the distrust in the community. There's, and particularly in the African American community, and that is an earned mistrust because the government has sponsored experiments in the Black community that directly abused and without consent their bodies. So Tuskegee is a well-known example, but there have been others. So we have to be able to address that head on when someone asks if this vaccine has been rapidly developed by the government in a really short timeline, how can I know that it's safe for me? So I'm working aggressively on that messaging as well. I think the conspiracy theories that are out there, they exist, and if your patients aren't telling you about them, then they may not be comfortable sharing them. But if you look on social media, in some of the doldrums there, these conspiracy theories are out there and they have traction. So I'll just put a few of them out there. One, that the coronavirus vaccine has a microchip implanted and is somehow related to Bill Gates and 5G technology, and that there's some sort of monitoring capability that's going to be attached to it, which is completely not true, but it's a conspiracy theory that's out there. There's another one that there's this bioluminescent material called luciferase that has actually been developed or in development by MIT, but not in any sort of licensed way. It's under experiment, but it's some sort of way that it could track whether you've received the vaccine or not. So there's a theory that it's being put into these vaccines in order for the government to track your movements. And again, the kind of thing that we may laugh at, but something that a lot of people in our community are taking seriously, including a pastor that I spoke with today who leads a large congregation, who asked me quite seriously, is this related to 5G technology? So we have to be aware that these are out there, in addition to the people who just say COVID is a hoax, which is a whole other conversation, but these are also people who need to be vaccinated. And then I think the last sort of category is the unknown itself, because this is relatively new technology, even though it's been studied for a while, as Dr. Seifried pointed out. But it's new for a lot of people, both in a sense that it's not common for people to ask, at least my experience, to ask exactly what's in a vaccine and how was it developed and what was the process. But now that we've had this sort of under a microscope for a long time, we're seeing what the scientific process is like, what the development process is like, and talking about these technologies that people just aren't used to thinking about. And when there's a void of information that's not being filled, then sometimes these other theories can kind of come in that are competing with the truth. So I think a targeted approach to making sure that we combat the distrust, that we give accurate information, and that we make it a safe space for our patients to explore these theories that they may have and question that they may have, because there is sometimes the level of respect that a patient has for a provider doesn't allow them to voice some of these concerns that they may have. But we have to level that and make it a safe space for people to really put out what their concerns are.
Yeah, I love that. I have to emphasize that. I actually did a Facebook Live with my patients today, and they're starved. They have lots of questions, and I think it's coming from us, those of us who know them, whether it's we're a pediatrician or their internal medicine doc. I think it makes a huge difference in giving them that opportunity. Dr. Seifert?
Tyson just had a fantastic summary there. I'm not sure how much more I can amplify, except I'll point out a couple things. So the first thing is I think that this group of pediatricians and internists, you guys are really, really experienced in having these conversations with vaccine hesitancy, and are the pros that are doing this on a day-to-day basis. And so I think it's going to be a lot of leveraging that knowledge and understanding, using the information and some of these issues like the conspiracy theories that Tyson talked about to provide that information for your patients. I think that's really going to be a very important part of all of this. As Tyson has alluded to, trying to find the right messenger is very important, and so that's something that we've been thinking a lot about for our patients and for our health system, is trying to find the right voices that can express and sort of provide the information that can be understood and it comes from a trusted source. And I think that you as clinicians are often that voice, or are usually that voice for a lot of your patients. So I would leverage your knowledge about how to provide that message. And I know there is sort of the challenge of of arguing against some of these conspiracy theories, but some of the things that I talked about earlier, I think can kind of help try to right set this in terms of people's concerns. There is this general concern about how quickly this has been developed. It's new, it's unknown. And I think there is some benefit to say, this is, while rapid, this has gone through the same checks and balances. It is these are clinical trials that are as large as any of the vaccine clinical trials that are normally performed. It's Shingrix, I think, had on the order of 18 or 20,000 persons, and many of you are used to using that vaccine in your patients. And to think that we have between these two clinical trials over 70,000 people that have been enrolled, and probably 250,000 people that have been enrolled around the world in all the clinical trials that are studying COVID vaccines. I think trying to provide that information, saying this is being done in a very rigorous process that is in line with how we would do any other clinical trial is helpful. So that'd be my additional comments to Tyson's.
Great, thanks. And I think Dr. Klein is ready and has agreed to help me pull some of these questions. Dr. Klein, you're on. What do we have?
We have very little time left. I again want to thank the panelists sincerely for giving their time, and for everybody who is giving their time by attending this. Two things. You're all healthcare providers. Heidi Larson is worth PubMeding, do a search, or Google her. She is a global expert in vaccine hesitancy, and she has very clearly demonstrated that the way to address this is to do exactly as Costi and Tyson have said, which is to allow your patients to have a voice, to voice their concerns, to respect their fears, to not be dismissive. That if we allow people to voice their concerns, it helps to get to the root of this. Be aware that VDH is trying extremely hard, having community conversations across the area with all sorts of groups of people, and we'll be having open forums to do just that, so we can help address this. And also be examples. As we all step forward to get our vaccines, we need to be very public and demonstrate to family, friends, and patients that we are doing this because we believe in this vaccine and we want to stop the pandemic. There is an issue that has been raised in the chat questions that I think needs clarification, which I will direct to Dr. Peak. There's a concern, especially in this group of primary care providers and pediatricians, that they are at the bottom, at the back of the line for the tier 1 allocation. Can you again reiterate the tiers within tier 1? So, because people are asking, where are they in the distribution in the allocation process?
Sure. So So I just want to also say that we have enough vaccine that's coming in December for this entire group. And so while it is, let's try to do the group within all of you who have risk, the ones that are actually caring for COVID patients first. It is not, a very hard line, and it's not that long before others can get vaccinated. So we're just talking about, weeks or, 1 or 2 or 3 weeks difference. So we're not talking about months, and I think it's important to understand that. So the way that the VDMAC layered the groups were the people who are directly caring for patients known or suspected to have COVID. That was the first group. And then the second is settings where the providers are taking care of patients that are at higher risk of contracting it. So we know that we've seen a lot of transmission in congregate settings, like in long-term care facilities. So that's the next group. And then the third group are other healthcare personnel who are doing clinical work and that are critical to keeping the healthcare system going. And then the fourth group is all other healthcare personnel that are caring for patients that don't have suspected or known COVID. And so the health systems are working out that, how to get the vaccine out there, and so are the local health departments. And so it should roll pretty quickly.
And
if we can get the vaccine delivered quickly, it should roll pretty quickly.
And all of the pediatricians, all of the primary care providers, all of those who take care of patients and are testing for COVID all the time and identifying cases, they are still in that first tier, in that first group of 480,000, correct?
I think it depends on what kind of practice. I think if you, we are really letting the healthcare systems work on for their systems and for those healthcare providers, how to meet that definition. So if you are testing patients for COVID, then I think you're pretty far, you're at risk. So I don't want to back a healthcare system into a corner. They're working through these, and they're going to try to get everybody vaccinated as quickly as they can.
Okay, another question that has come up. There's some discussion in the chat. Dr. Sifri answered the question about mRNA virus that was talked about, the safety of the mRNA vaccine, even though it's new. But we're very short on time. Another specific question, I'll just toss it to Dr. Bell. Anti-inflammatories, NSAIDs. What are the recommendations for the use of NSAIDs for treating side effects or obviously we're being told not to use them. What about people who rely on them? Should they be stopped?
Sure. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Sifri, because we were talking about this earlier today, but there wasn't specific advice given on whether to stop or continue taking these. But in general, you do want the immune system to generate a good response to the injection itself. And so, if you need it for symptoms, if they're kind of out of control, then it's okay to take, but generally try to shy away from it.
Yeah, yes, I think that's right. Can be used for symptomatic use. There's recommendations not to use it prior to, for using it as a pre-medication. And I haven't seen anything there. It's sort of been silent on the chronic use of NSAIDs. So I think that's where we're at.
And the last question that we have time for is about long-term effects. And I think it is quite clear that we do not yet know, that nobody has that answer. Is that correct?
Yeah,
that's true. We are going to need to actually collect the long-term side effects for the vaccine, and there's always a possibility that something might appear down the road. But what I can say about the mRNA technology is that it's not completely novel. I mean, the first paper on it was published in 1989, and there's been attempts to try to incorporate into the technology, but they've made some leaps and bounds in recent years. So it's not completely novel, as at least to the research world, although it's the first time being used in a vaccine platform. But as far as I know, from what I've read on mRNA, I think the mRNA that was injected into my arm at this point today is probably broken down completely by this point. And my body's just focusing on making spike protein. So I wouldn't expect that the effects of the mRNA would last and become some sort of long-term side effect. Another thing that we should definitely mention, because this is another part of the conspiracy theories, is does it get incorporated into your DNA? And it's important to put out there that the mRNA, our bodies make mRNA, usually, to affect protein expression. But the mRNA that's injected by the vaccine does not get into your cell nucleus and therefore does not interact with your DNA. And does not have the ability to kind of retroactively create DNA itself as well. So that should not be a concern. And so we of course have to collect the data, but I have expectation that this will be a safe long-term product as well.
Last thing, we don't have time, but someone asked yes, exactly. So someone asked a question about a patient on immunosuppressant therapy. The CDC has just released guidance on categories of patients and with detailed considerations. Those are available on the CDC website. And also, we are going to now show you the VDH vaccine website. All of the current CDC recommendations and important links are there. They are updated daily. It is very current. And so we would like for you to be aware of this very useful resource. We need to, unfortunately, end the conversation. I am extremely grateful to our panelists, to everybody who's taking the time to be here. So here's the VDH vaccine website. You can find the answer to the question about patients on immunosuppressants there. And with that, again, I thank you, and we need to let everybody go home and get some rest, or stay home and get some rest.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.